Hello again, this is Chris, MTGO user Rex Dart, and this is part 2 in my video series about the popular deck archetypes in the Tribal Apocalypse player run event and in a larger sense in the Tribal Legacy Wars format. And once again, as with the first video, we're going to be examining some specific deck lists which were successful in the player run event over the last 2 years. And in the first video we talked about Sligh-style Aggro decks, and this week we're going to be looking at Linear Aggro decks. And since some of you may or may not be familiar with the distinction between those decks, I'm going to kind of go over quickly what I think the distinction, how I'm defining them, and I will also talk about the different strengths and weaknesses of those styles of aggro deck. The Sligh deck, which we talked about in the first video, is highlighted by cheap, efficient creatures. And each of these creatures is designed to be individually a threat. You deploy the creatures, you use your burn spells in order to clear blockers out of the way. You also use those spells to get in the last few points of damage. You have a rigid mana curve. You need to be focused very much on the 1 and 2 slots, a few 3s, maybe a couple of 4s, but usually even not that. And we saw the historical origins of that mana curve. Your goal is to simply get your opponent from 20 to 0 as quickly as possible. We also saw that historically the Sligh decks used mana sinks, abilities on creatures that and artifacts that allowed you to do something with all of your mana every turn to get a little bit of value out of any mana you had. The linear aggro decks, what we're talking about here is a more synergistic creature base, and I think it's one of the things that most people think of if they're new to building a tribal deck. They're like, oh, I have all of these birds, and I have this card that pumps birds, and I have this guy that pumps birds, and blah 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 blah, and they try to build a synergistic style of aggro deck with all these pumpers and other cards like that. That's sort of the most basic level 0 of a linear aggro deck. But that's a pretty good sort of working definition to give you an idea. Whereas the Sligh deck is always going to be using burn spells, the linear aggro deck may or may not need to have burn spells, and it has more room to have support cards that work with its creature base. The mana curve for the linear aggro deck is more flexible. You want particular creatures because of what they do with your other creatures, not simply because they happen to be the most efficient creature your tribe has available at the 1 or 2 mana slot. The goal of the linear aggro deck is still to knock the opponent from 20 to 0, but to do so by obtaining a overwhelming board position, a critical mass of 3 or 4 guys, sometimes more, possibly less, that works together to create a board position that your opponent cannot overcome and from which you will inevitably win. And again, whereas Sligh may or may not now have any need for these mana sinks to try to maximize its mana usage, linear aggro has the ability in the end game. Its equivalent to that is that it can go big to some extent. It won't always go very big. You probably won't see a lot of 6 drops, but it does have some ability to do that. And some of the different strengths and weaknesses of these. In your Sligh decks, each card is individually a threat, whereas linear aggro requires multiple cards to be on board working together in order to equal and surpass the opponent's threats. The Sligh deck can play around sweepers, whereas the linear aggro deck almost always has to overextend. And now sweepers are so ubiquitous in the format. Every control deck is running 4, 6, sometimes even 8 of them, that sometimes it may be silly to talk about whether or not you can play around sweepers. It's just one of those things. Everyone's going to get caught with them, but the Sligh deck can deploy a threat, and it doesn't need to commit more to the board necessarily, depending on what its hand is. So it does have the potential to play around that, whereas linear aggro decks nearly always need to sort of vomit their hand onto the board. There's a limit. You can be smart about it, but they do have to commit more of a board presence than Sligh decks do, and so they are weaker to sweepers in general. Sligh is weak to life gain, because it only has a certain number of cards to get you down from 20 to 0. If you gain 6, 8, 10 life, every time you gain 2 or 3 life with a card, as long as you're getting some other value to it, it isn't just a pure life gain card, that's basically giving you card advantage against Sligh. Whereas Linear Aggro can kind of ignore life gain because its board position can be so dominating that it doesn't matter if you have to kill your opponent from 20 or kill them from 40, because your plan is just going to be better than theirs a great percentage of the time. Sligh decks are okay against spot removal. The creatures are all cheap. The amount of mana you're putting into it relative to the amount of mana going into the removal spell is probably pretty close to parity. And again, it's only, you just replace every guy that dies with the next guy, and they're all more or less equivalent. Whereas Linear Aggro can be very weak to spot removal, not only because they may have some critical creatures that are really powerful to pump the rest of the team, that removing them is very damaging, but also because they just need to get, like I said, to that critical mass of having 3, 4 guys on board, and if they can never get to that critical mass, then their game plan stalls. Sligh decks have the burn spells to give them reach. If they do stall out, you can finish the game just by top decking a lightning bolt or a fire blast or something along those lines. Linear Aggro deck, if it does stall out and it needs to close the game quickly because it's getting outclassed, it may have a more difficult time doing that quickly. Sligh decks are just faster in general. They can race combo decks depending on the speed of the combo and the speed of your particular tribal build of Sligh. Certainly Linear Aggro decks have a much more difficult time doing that, and usually cannot race combo, although there are some notable exceptions. Sligh decks are likely to be outclassed by the mid-game. As early as, say, turn 3, if the opponent dropped a Rock Swarm Monk, you're going to find that thing is an enormous roadblock to your plan, whereas Linear Aggro decks, their board position can rival any threat. If you're playing against a control opponent and his plan is to get to turn 6 and drop a Grave Titan or something like that, that Grave Titan might outclass anything in the Sligh deck, but that Grave Titan does not outclass your position of 3 or 4 strong guys working together in the Linear Aggro deck. Finally, and let's not forget, because this is important, Linear Aggro may very well be fun to play. You have a lot of board interactions, you have a lot of interesting creatures that you can use, and of course that's why we're all playing in this format in the first place, is not just to win. Winning is fun, but also to win in a way that we find exciting, and Linear Aggro may be the way that you like to do that. Now I'm going to take a look at 4 decks. All of these decks were successful in the event, and I'm going to use these decks to illustrate some of the strengths and weaknesses that we've just been discussing here of Linear Aggro decks. And this first one is Mia Hitler's deck from July 24th, 2011. It is a vampire deck. And this deck went undefeated on the day. I think that he would probably be the first to tell you this deck is not necessarily optimized in the sense that both the Vampire Nocturnus and the Bloodghast point to probably a desire to have somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 fetch lands, whereas he's just using 25 basic swamps here. But in general, this deck is a little bit different. You can see right off the bat from your Sligh-style decks in that the mana curve doesn't even begin on the Vampire Tribal creature base until 2. In fact, these Gatekeeper of Malakirs are really 3 drops effectively, so he only has 6 creatures at the 2 spot. He may very well use his first turn doing nothing, since he has no 1-drops. His second turn he may just Sign in Blood, depending on how much pressure is on him, or use a removal spell. And it's not until probably the 3rd and 4th turns when he starts getting going on this deck. The Bloodghasts are a great way to, again, they're very resistant to removal. You can bring them back from the graveyard. It helps overcome board sweepers, as we were talking about the problem earlier. You can follow up a sweeper by just dropping a land and bringing back any Bloodghasts that you had. The Galastria Highborns also give you a way to be resistant to those board sweepers. Depending on how much mana you have open, you can get some value out of him wrathing the board and possibly come back over the top and have enough. The Mutilates, you don't always see a sweeper in a deck like this, but it is something that is played that you do need to be aware of, that sometimes an aggro deck like this can take on a bit of a more mid-rangey control pose, and sometimes we'll play a card like this. Now he is playing, of course, the fantastic Vampire Lord here, Vampire Nocturnus, and a couple cards just to go up top here. Malakir Blood Witch, which is a very well positioned card in the Tribal Legacy Wars format, because the most popular removal spells in the player run event are Lightning Bolt and Swords to Plowshares, both of which are blank against Malakir Blood Witch. So a very resistant spell here that if you want to follow up a board sweeper with a big threat, Malakir Blood Witch is good. Obviously you only want this as, say, a 2 of, you don't want more than that, because it is does cost 5. And we also see here that he used Corrupt, which is really a good idea, and you do see this a lot certainly in mono black decks. It's a fantastic finisher spell, and if you do find that your deck is being outclassed, and as we were talking about earlier, where linear aggro decks may need to close the game out quickly, he's running 25 lands here, so he has a pretty good shot of getting to a decent land count and being able to simply finish the opponent off with a massive Corrupt, even if his creature aggro plan somehow gets blanked. So again, there's a very good example of a linear aggro deck that illustrates some of those points, and I'm going to go ahead and move on to another deck here. This is Allies, and this is a different style of linear aggro deck. It doesn't use lords per se, but what it does do is play all these allies which have various spell-like effects. Either they grow bigger, or they give you protection from colors, or they give you guys lifelink or haste or something like that whenever another one comes on board. So obviously you need to have the plan of having multiple of these guys on board. So again, you can't simply rely on having one and beating in with it and finishing off the opponent. So this deck here, which again Nagarjuna played March 17th of this year to a first place finish and was undefeated, is very similar to the Zendikar Alara standard allies builds. It's Naya colored, just like those were. It uses many of the same creatures which are in there. It also uses Blood Braid Elf, which hits every card in the deck other than the Talus Paladin. So that can get you some extra value out of bringing up another ally. It's using the Punishing Fire Grove of the Burn Willows combo, which does two things for him. Again, one thing is that this gives him a little bit of reach. He can not only can he control the opponent's creatures by using this as just a repeatable source of removal against other small creatures, but he can also use this to finish off an opponent when he just happens to need the last few damage. So even with an empty hand, if he has Punishing Fire in the graveyard and Grove of the Burn Willows in play, he can finish off an opponent from there. So it gives him a better game against a control player in that sense as well. So it does double duty there, basically. He also has Kessig Wolf runs, which give him inevitability as well, because that does change the fundamental dynamic of the linear aggro deck, in that suddenly with the Kessig Wolf run out, any one of these guys could be a game-ending threat, whereas previously these guys are rather underwhelming on their own. But of course, I think this list here is just about as optimal as you could get a list like this to be. It was a very impressive list, and I can't think of how you might improve on it. We're going to look at one more list, actually I think two. We have here a Knights list by GBAGYT. This list was first place undefeated March 26th of 2011. And this list shows some of the advantages and disadvantages very starkly that we were talking about earlier. He has gone all the way out to probably the extremes of the sort of Lord style of linear aggro deck here. He is not only playing Wiltleaf Lieges, which double pump most of the creatures in the deck. He's also playing, in fact, I think they double pump every creature except for the Knight Exemplar and the Kinsvale Cavalier, two other lords that he used. He's playing Knight of New Alara, which double pumps nearly every creature in the deck, and triple pumps the Bant Sureblade. Again, this is very, very heavy on the the Lord style of linear play. If he gets a number 3-4 guys in play in any one of these Lords, his board position is simply going to be absolutely dominating. He is used here Steward of Valoron also to give him a little bit of a way to more quickly get to these 4-drop Lords, which I think is a really great idea, and something that I've fooled around with in making Kaleidoscope decks as well. Knight of the Reliquary, I do want to talk about this. One of the things you do get to do in these sort of linear aggro decks is do remember, even though you are trying to build around a synergy and have your guys support each other, that sometimes the most important thing you can do for your deck is just to have some cards that are just, you know, dang good on their own. And Knight of the Reliquary certainly is that. A Knight of the Reliquary on the board, no matter what else you have on the board, is a threat that has to be dealt with and has to be respected in a way that some other cards might not, absent a larger board presence. So that's one thing to always think about, is sometimes just, if you can, go for raw power in a deck like this. Now, his deck, one of the flaws in his deck, and I'll say it was obviously good enough to go undefeated, it does look like it is lacking in some reach. It's also lacking in any kind of disruption against board sweepers, and given the amount of mana that he has to invest to get to a good board position here, that does seem like a problem. He's running Gaddock Teague, which would fight those. Knight Exemplar and Dauntless Escort can both fight those. A sort of different way to think about fighting and recovering from a board sweeper is something like Lightning Greaves, which, if you have that on the board, you can simply, any guy that you plop down to recover from a sweeper has haste, which is an enormous difference from having to wait one turn before you can actually start doing any more damage. And of course it pulls double duty here in helping to protect some of these critical Lords from the spot removal, which would otherwise plague them. So again, he's done a deck here which could have better game probably against control than it does, but is certainly example of how the Sligh-style Aggro decks can get outclassed very quickly. Because when you look at the decks we looked at in last video, what are a lot of those decks going to do to something like a Wiltleaf Cavaliers or a Wiltleaf Liege coming down as early as turn 3 off of, say, a Steward of Valoron? He's also got some life gain in here, virtue of the Armadillo Cloak. He's got Double Strike from the Kinsvale Cavalier. The Sligh decks really hate creatures with Double Strike and First Strike, because sometimes to clear a larger guy you need to just attack into it and then burn it away, which you're going to have trouble doing. So again, this is the kind of thing that could, by going a little bigger, could certainly give fits to a straightforward Sligh-style aggro deck. And I imagine that that was part of the success that he had with this list. Now I'm going to go ahead and look at one last list here, and this is an Elves list, and I think that you could technically call this Linear Aggro, although it may even be viewed more as, it's certainly linear, but it may be viewed more as a linear combo, or alternatively maybe even a big mana deck, depending on how you want to look at it. Because this particular build, and Big Brothers ran this on August 11th, he's sort of the head elf honcho of the player run event, certainly for this year, whereas a lot of people run things like Azuri Renegade Leader, which are probably more straightforward linear aggro decks. He focuses entirely on the huge mana aspect of the elves and how to exploit that with Staff of Domination as a mana sink, Biorhythm, which could instantly win the game against a control opponent and certainly put you in a better position than your opponent given the nature of your deck, Hurricane as one of the only direct damage style finishers available in green. And you do see here some of the principles we were talking about earlier. You do have to extend pretty heavily here, but into a board sweeper. He's got Harmonize to try to recover from that if that does happen. Alternatively, he can just use Harmonize to dig for one of his win conditions if he's not being under threat of having his board swept. The other thing that Elves has over some of the other linear aggro decks is that it can go off much, much more quickly than most of the decks we've been looking at earlier today. And some board sweepers may simply be too late to do anything. I know that Wrath of God, Damnation, the 4 CMC board sweepers sometimes are a turn too late against elves, certainly when you are on the draw. And so one of the things that you want to maybe consider if you expect elves to be around are things like Pyroclasm and Fire Spout, which is my personal favorite, as they have the ability to do enough damage quickly enough, especially Fire Spout, which will kill all the elves even through, say, a double Elvish Archdruid draw or something like that. But in general, this is a pretty standard look at this, and I'm not the elf expert to go through this, but I did want to show it because I thought it is an example of a very hyperlinear deck that does see regular play. I will say that I thought about running a goblins, showing a goblins list here, but I will show quite quickly what the problem with showing a goblins list is. I'm going to load up a legacy goblins list that I used to play a couple years ago. You'll see right now the problem with traditional goblins, the more linear style of goblins here with matrons, ringleaders, incinerators, commanders, all this sort of business, is that the lackeys and the aether vials are banned. So you can't, your whole plan there, the ringleaders really rely heavily on the aether vial and goblin lackey in order to get the right kind of value out of them. And so I think that what we have seen when goblins have been played in the event is not really that linear an aggro deck at all, but in fact just sort of a Sligh deck in which it's using the cheapest, most efficient goblins and a combination of them and burn spells. The closest thing you do see to linear might be something like the Koldathis style decks, but even those are really only vomiting their hand onto the board so they can make use of Battlecry, not necessarily any synergies in those decks other than perhaps Goblin Chieftain being included. So goblins is something that, while it has been present in the event over the last couple of years, when I actually did the research, did not turn out to look very much like I expected it to look like. And again, I think that the banned list in the Tribal Apocalypse Player Run event has a lot to do with that. So anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this look at the linear aggro decks in the Tribal Apocalypse Player Run event in the Tribal Legacy Wars format on Magic the Gathering Online. And I think this should wrap up my look at the more straightforward aggro decks, and I'll move on to a different deck style in my next video. And thank you for joining me.